Okay. So, for our last segment before the test, we are going to look at what's called prey distribution and community, but really it's looking at this kind of community aspect, where we kind of left our last topic, this population cycle piece, talking about how we know that most predator and prey relationships are not super tightly linked, largely because there's usually more than one predator and one prey involved. So we want to start looking at, well, what exactly is the effect of having sort of multiple individuals together creating this community, and what effect does that have? How can we look at that? Okay, so what we do know in general, what we've gotten to from here, as we think about things like population abundance, population distribution, right, our previous units, is that all of these interactions have this potential to reduce growth. So remember, we think about like our density dependent factors, right? Survival and reproduction of the organisms that are being eaten, right, our prey. So let's take a look at the graphic we have on here. Okay, so we have a double bar graph. That was a big beastie. Okay. So on our left hand y-axis, brain is just gone. We're going to be going through this slow. We have percent plant cover. Let me actually match the colors here. Okay, so that's going to match with our plants dependent variable. On the right side, see we have beetle density. It's going to match with our animal dependent variable. Okay, so this is a common graph type. If you took Bio 130 way back when we were still doing the bead lab, you guys actually drew one of these, although I don't think we did it with the two different axes when we did it. Okay. In any case, when we do these things, we still only have the one independent variable, right? Which in this case is just time. It's a pretty straightforward one as far as line graphs go, or year. Okay, so what we're interested in here is looking at what are, or is, the potential relationship or ships between our two population abundances. Okay, so we haven't done any experiment here. This is just observational. I have data for beetle density. I have data for weed percent cover. These are probably photographs right from above. I want to see, is there a relationship between them? Okay, so let's take a peek at this. If I were to try to interpret this, okay, let's just focus on my weed for a second. What's happening with my weed? Right, so I had some amount, and then we actually see this spike. And then it's goodbye, Felicia. So spike's kind of weird, right? Okay, so let's build in now our beetle relationship. So if I build in my beetle relationship, we see sort of a similar relationship. Okay. I had no beetles, and then beetles came in, so maybe this is where they were introduced. We'll talk about invasion and introduction later. Okay, and then I see my beetles increase. Why do you think that my beetle population is increasing? Because their food source is high, right? You're a happy little beetle, chomp the plant. Yum, yum. Okay, so we have happy little beetles chomping our Klamath weed, right? All right, so now we see our beetles hit a peak and then hit a decline. Why are our beetles declining now? Our food resources declining, right? So we actually see almost a small snapshot of some population cycle in here. As our beetles respond to the pathway of our weed, right? And there's actually one other thing that we can maybe see that's going on in here. What might be one explanation for the spike in that plant? So why do we see, let's look at this. Why might the plant be increasing? Okay, so we do have relatively low amounts, so we could have low predator populations. Okay, we did introduce the beetle in that area though, so what if it had started being eaten during that period? Why else might we see a weird spike? It ends up dying. That's not a bad idea. So Jordan says invasive species. That's the plant was here first and had been here for a while. So what happens when plants get chomped on? Compensation. So a plant has a new predator, and so the first thing it does is respond by compensation. We see an increase in plant cover. And now, like we saw with our Genetian plants, compensation will only take us so far. As the beetles continue to increase and continue to eat our plant friends, right? We've eaten too much plant tissue. All right, good night. Thanks for all the fish. Now, it's not necessarily compensation. It's not necessarily all compensation. It's hard to tell just from one graph exactly what's going on, but it's a good hypothesis sort of looking at the pieces we have here. Any questions about this? Okay, let's talk a little bit about introduction. As we see, okay, predators have dramatic effects on communities. Okay. So introductions of predators can have really strong effects on a community. So for example, if I were to introduce a wasp that preys on a crop-eating insect, that can decrease the density of the crop-eating insect by more than 95%. And you can imagine why we would do this, right? Because this also then reduces the economic loss to the farmers, to that community, okay, caused by the pests. And this is common, right? Sometimes this is cheaper. It's organic. You can kind of track the effect on the plants a little easier, thus on the people a little easier, and all of that. So we call this purposeful introduction biocontrol. Okay. Literally the controlling of another organism by the use of a biological mechanism. Right? And we do this via what we would normally consider a predator. Okay, so you could put in, for example, here, right, like a ladybug. Okay, a praying mantis were really common in Maine, where I came from. It's cruel from an insect perspective, right? Okay, cats were once really common. Right? If you had an island filled with rats, bring a cat. Okay, they're great hunters. You can also add parasites or parasitoids. So wasps, for example, are commonly parasitoids. Conceptually the same thing. Okay, they're going to lay their eggs in all the hungry caterpillars. Okay, and then their babies will do the job of wiping out all of the crop-destroying organisms. Parasites have also been added. More recently, like for example, dealing with Zika, an all-male only population of mosquitoes were released into populations to reduce how easily, right, that population can breed. Males, one, do not suck blood. Only the females are bloodsuckers. And males can't lay eggs. So when you skew populations really heavily that way, it reduces the ability of populations to breed. Right? So we're reducing or introducing a specific parasite. So all of these are forms of biocontrol. Now, as we can imagine, okay, these are good, bad things, right? When you start messing around with communities, okay, you start then affecting outcomes. Okay? So, for example, predators and herbivores, okay, alter our entire trophic system. Okay, so we think about being like a tertiary consumer. And when you are adding in a tertiary consumer, right, you're affecting the whole chain of events that happens below. You're adding a new competitor, or just plain a new predator. So you're going to affect the distribution or abundance of species. Even weirder stuff can happen. So if our predator decreases the performance of another top competitor, if I'm a tertiary consumer and you've added a tertiary consumer, that makes me not very competitive, right? So he's out competing me. I'm now doing a poor job, or perhaps I even die out or migrate away. Okay. Someone else that I was suppressing may now step into the spotlight. So here's an example of this. Okay. This is using the same image here. The starfish are really common predators in what are called the Intertidal Zone. Right, so the area of the seashore where the tide comes in and out. And so when the starfish is around, a lot of other large predators, so things like limpets, bivalves are right, like clams, okay, those types of things, mussels, that whole business. So most of the other ones in its same sort of size class were locally extinct, right, extirpated. Okay? So they were outcompeted. The starfish, believe it or not, is a voracious predator. Okay, for a marine invertebrate, it moves quite quickly. It's little tube feet. Okay, it's got many arms to grab food. It can handle food much easier than most other predators of its size. Okay, so it's just kind of actually a nasty dude, even though we think they're so sweet and cute. So with the exception of one other mussel species, pretty much everything else in its size and trophic level wasn't able to hang out with it. Okay. So what these guys did was experimentally remove starfish. I can only imagine how they actually had to do this in the 1970s, like manually, what, just like walk around, pick up starfish, I don't know. Okay, but once they did that, okay, all the other competitors in my blue box actually were able to return to the intertidal zone. And these guys are all pretty much equivalent. So we ended up with a much higher diversity of invertebrate predators. And the paper goes on to talk about like what that did for all of the things in the food chain below them. But what we care about is really, let's just focus on one thing, right? All of the competitors and what the effect on there was. So by removing one thing, 5 other competitors were able to join up. So we call this situation a keystone species. And so a keystone species is any species where the addition or removal of it is going to cause a really dramatic change. Okay, so the entire ecosystem is basically dependent on it, so the entire structure of it. Right? So the keystone species here, right, is our starfish. And when we removed that species, the entire ecosystem restructured. Our whole trophic chain fell apart and had to reassemble itself, now that this just one little species was gone. And that's not that common. It's not saying that one species wouldn't come in. That's not that big of a deal, right? If you remove gray squirrels, the whole ecosystem is not going to fall apart, right? There's still chipmunks, and there's still all these other things that pretty much do the same thing. Would the ecosystem notice? Maybe. Is the ecosystem going to fall apart? Probably not, right? So that's the big difference here. That makes sense? Is that very clear? Okay, so let's look at an example of predators and introduction and that whole business. Okay, so we are going to introduce a predator. So we have an island. It's nice to work with islands, right? And we're going to introduce the sweet little baby, the Arctic fox. All right, so here's what ended up happening. We introduced the Arctic fox, to help control seabird density, which was driving people insane. And it worked. We reduced seabird density nearly 100-fold, right? So 3 orders of magnitude. Okay? Or partly because some seabirds were eaten, their eggs were eaten, they didn't want to nest there anymore. You can imagine, right, the chain of events. Now, the downside is this also reduced guano. That's seabird poop. Basically any poop that falls from the sky. It's called bat poop guano as well. All right, so guano is one of those good things. You can imagine thusly. All right, seabird poop fertilizes plants on the island. Okay. Also, links the ocean to the land for the people that live there. And so what I want you to look at is, one, what are the changes that we see? How can they be this loud? You're thinking about what are the trophic levels and ecosystem shifts that we might see. Okay, so this is a grassland now. What might we see a shift to if we are short on fertilizer? Okay. What kind of organisms might we see a shift to if we think about trophic levels? Okay. And then thinking about what kind of biome might we shift to, so think biggest picture of all. Okay. All right, so let's take a hot second. I haven't done one of these for a while. This will be fun. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things you expected to find. So what sort of organism changes might we expect? The trophic level, community, or ecosystem? What kinds of things did you put under that box? Okay, so potentially we might see fox prey switching. What other kinds of things might we find here? We're going to turn this into a barren wasteland. It's Maine with Arctic foxes, right? We didn't have Arctic foxes. It would have been way better. What kind of producers then would you expect to find? Competitive ones at the very least, right? We're competing now for, at least put that. So we're competing for nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're going to have plants that are really competitive. Grass is really good with temperature and water, but I think anybody who's seen a lawn die knows it's a little on the fussy side with its fertilizer. All right, so we see our foxes prey switching. So we're probably going to see an impact lower down the food chain as well, right? You guys have anything else I'm blatantly ignoring on you? Okay. So you guys did a great job really focusing on this primary producer business, right? So we're reducing, look, you rude thing, these grasses. We're really reducing down our overall primary producer biomass. Okay. And some of these other plants, let me get this out of here. Okay. We talked about competition, right? These like dense little shrubberies, which tend to be things that are really competitive. We'll see an increase of those. Right, so you'll basically have a smattering of plants that do really well as they compete for this nitrogen and phosphorus, and most of that grass is going to die off. So if we think about this from a biome perspective, really? Okay, that grassland is going to go, right? While all the grass is gone. So we really do kind of turn this in to that sort of very sparse wasteland. Okay, so it's still very cold. That's the key. And we have that sporadic plants on it. So we don't have the forest, it can't be boreal. So we push this to the tundra. Okay. Let's do some graph practice. What is this graph telling me? Take a hot second, look it over, and then let's work through it. Okay. What is our y-axis here? What's NPP? Oh, productivity. That help a little bit? Okay, so NPP is net primary productivity. So basically our y-axis is plant stuff. Okay, the amount of plant stuff there is lying around. Okay, so what is our x-axis? What's a gosling? It's a baby goose. It's beginning to think I failed you all. A baby goose. We all know that geese are inherently evil. If you've ever been chased by one, you do know this is true. Okay? So inherently evil baby geese are eating. This is the amount of time they're spending eating. We're looking at what's the response of some plants, how long they're spending, right, their wicked ways. Okay, so what are we seeing here? Okay, what's the 0 then? That's our control. Good. Right? No evil baby geese have been unleashed upon that plant site, right? So this is how much plants normally grow. Okay, so what do we see here then? How can I interpret the rest of this? Okay, so 30 is my peak. Okay, so I see that this is bigger than this. Why? Why, if goslings are eating, is that bigger than the control? Compensation. Good. We can all, by the way, be annoyed by the fact there's no error bars on here. Okay, so that's -5 points for the authors. Okay, after the 30 minutes of evil gosling behavior, we see that the more evil gosling time the plants get, okay, while this is still more than the control, although this is questionably significant, this starts to reduce down. What's happening here? Right, so compensation isn't able to keep up or compensate, right, for the amount of tissue damage. So too much damage. Crazy evil goslings. Go away. Just pretend there's an E there. I can get it on the board. There we go. Okay, so we've seen this before, right? Too much clipping. And the plants are not able to come back. So I would hypothesize the more time that the evil goslings get, right, the more low our bars would become until we probably drop below the control, right? Evil goslings do great damage. Okay? In fact, this is what we saw. So lesser snow geese, okay, a specific type of goose and gosling, right, ended up increasing exponentially in abundance because one of their overwintering areas became a crop area. So what we saw is what this graph told us, right, is at very high densities, they overcame compensation, basically ended up decimating all of the vegetation there. Okay, starting with the crops and then the marsh area itself. Okay, so they became a keystone species, okay, largely because the abundance switch, they always were there, but because they basically quadrupled in amount, they were basically like a plague of locusts on the area. It ended up altering the entire landscape. It only as geese, which to me is much more terrifying than a plague of locusts. I don't know, man. Okay, that is it. We are going to stop there. I'll leave this up for a hot second in case you're finishing up. Please make sure if you have any questions, I'm around a lot more, of course, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. Well, still on Fridays. You don't have to take it at like 2 in the morning. So make sure that you get any help that you need. Otherwise, have a fantastic day. It's still supposed to be in the 60s. Very cold. And do have a good day. And you're free to go whenever you're done. That was not what I was doing. I wanted to do that just a second.